Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. With the U.S. distracted in the Middle East, and despite Trump's bluster about a new trade war with China, does China really have anything to worry about? Let's get to the bottom line. The United States has the biggest economy in the world, but China is second and catching up real fast. And this has made America, well, really increasingly testy. American politicians, both Democrat and Republican, have been talking for decades about the need to counter the threat of China and its growing influence, not only in Africa and Latin America, but all over the world. It's not just about banning TikTok. China produces 8 times more steel than America and double the number of cars and trucks, dominates the solar industry, and controls 80% of the minerals needed for electric vehicles. So despite the trade tensions, and let's call it the Great Wall of Tariffs, launched by President-elect Donald Trump in his first term and continued by President Joe Biden, how worried is China about relations with the next Trump White House? Welcome to this special edition of the show, coming to you from the Doha Forum in Qatar, where we're talking with Victor Gao, the Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization in Beijing. I'm so glad you were able to join us today. Thank you very much. Let me just start out. There have been a lot of changes in the global topography of leadership. Over 4 billion people voted in elections this year, and one of those elections was in the United States, my country. And Donald Trump won that election. And Donald Trump has had a lot to say on China, and he's been very tough on China. But my sense is China's not freaking out about Donald Trump. But what is your view of how China sees the coming Trump years?
First of all, congratulations on Donald Trump's winning this presidential election. He actually deserved it. And now he not only has won the presidency, but the Republicans have now been in control of the House as well as the Senate. So it's a sweeping win for Mr. Trump as well as the Republican Party.
Does it seem a little bit, not to be too facetious, like one-party rule?
Well, it will never be one-party rule in the United States. In 4 years' time, or 8 years' time, or 12 years' time, there will be a change of leadership in the White House. And for the 2 houses, it may change in 2 years or 4 years. So I think a change is the rule of the game, rather than no change or always continuous in the same party control of the United States. Having said that, I do admire Donald Trump for demonstrating audacity and leadership and control of himself, as well as the environment, when an attempted assassination on his life was committed. He really impressed many people, including me, and it meant that Mr. Trump had a mission to do, and he wants to get his job done. So it depends on what exactly he wants to do. He wants to do a revolution inside the United States, and he also wants to promote this mega in the world. And I think whatever he will do or accomplish for the coming 4 years, the United States will not be the same as it is today.
Well, as I hear it, a lot of the MAGA or Make America Great Again rhetoric has a lot to do with bashing China, talking about tariffs against Chinese products, dealing with Chinese threats around the world. And there's a kind of China hysteria, if you will, in part of the political rhetoric of that. So I'm interested in how you're hearing that. Are you hearing it differently than I am?
First of all, tariff seems to be the preferred instrument for Mr. Trump, or for
everybody,
or for his incoming administration. However, I would say someone need to really tell Mr. Trump, the president-elect and soon to be the president, that the tariffs are paid by the American people, mostly the consumers. It's not paid by China or the Chinese government at all. So in a sense, the tariffs against China or against the Canadians or the Mexicans or any other country are a kind of tax against the American people. It is one of the reasons why it fueled inflation and eroded the quality of life of the American people. I'm sure Mr. Trump cares about a more balanced trade, but tariff is probably the worst instrument he can wield on imports. there must be other ways which can help the Americans achieve their strategic goal without, for example, inflating the tariffs, because the tariffs are paid by the American people.
Some smart people I know say that power is like the stock market. It's a function of future expectations. And if you look at China in the future, it looks like it's got a great future. It's growing, bigger footprint, greater economy, becoming eventually the largest economy in the world. And some people look at the United States as somewhat contracting strategically, more diminished ambitions, more negativity in managing what it has. And so they see a rising China and somewhat of a sinking America. How do you see it?
My view is that there is no competition between China and the United States.
Really?
Really. Why? Because China is ahead of the United States in many areas. The United States is ahead of China in many areas. The natural endowments for China and the United States are completely different. On the other hand, China will continue to grow. I remember in the 1990s when I was practicing investment banking with Morgan Stanley in New York and in Hong Kong, US was about 8 times as big as China in terms of the size of the economy. Now China is ahead of the United States if we use purchasing power parity, and if we use a nominal exchange rate, China is anywhere between 65 to 70% of the United States. However, if you listen to Elon Musk, who is very influential vis-a-vis President-elect Donald Trump, he keeps saying that by the middle of the century, the size of the Chinese economy will be doubling the size of the US economy. I think he may have some reason to say this, and I think China will continue to grow. Sooner or later, China will be larger as an economy compared to the United States using official exchange rate. When exactly that moment will be, I do not know. Maybe 2030, 2035, etc. However, I think this is not the real competition. If there is one competition between the United States and China, the real competition, I would say that will be, for example, if China wants to impose its ideology, its political system, its way of doing things onto the United States, or vice versa. The United States wants to change China into a completely different system. But I can assure you, China has no desire, no capability, no willingness, no resources to do that at all against any other country, especially against the United States.
Victor, let me ask you about national security and foreign policy interests of China. And, so when I look out there in the world, we were all sort of woke up one day and Chinese diplomacy was key to resolving a major tension here in the Middle East. We're talking here in Doha, and China ended up being the bridge between the Saudis and the Iranians in a normalization arrangement. Was really shocking. The United States was not involved. Is this an indication of a more robust and engaged Chinese foreign policy in real deep disputes?
Well, I would say China's effort to achieve a rapprochement between Saudis and the Iranians was a turning point in Chinese diplomacy. Why? Because for decades, China had very good relations with Saudi Arabia on the one hand and with Iran on the other hand. Many times, Saudis would tell China, well, given our special relationships, why don't you downgrade your relationship with Iran? China said no. China-Saudi relations are very important, but China-Iranian relations are also very important. And to Iran, it's the same thing. But sooner or later, China reached a point, and China said, why couldn't I bring my good relations with Saudi Arabia and my relations with Iran to the same table, bring the two great countries together, and convince them that rapprochement is better? I think that's the turning point. And it's so fortunate that both the Saudi Arabians and the Iranians listened to this and achieved rapprochement. This will be a landmark event, not only for the Middle East, but also for the Islamic faith of different affiliations. And I think China wants to do more of these major breakthroughs in diplomacy. You will see China being very actively engaged with other countries, try to solve the disputes between and among themselves.
Well, you know, one of the big raging conflicts in the world right now, of course, is Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I paid careful attention to what China has said about it, concerns over sovereignty, but we're not wanting to intervene. Sometimes, to be honest, it's confusing to me to listen to Chinese diplomats describe which side of the line they're on. But clearly, another part of this is the relationship between China and Russia that has no bounds, that, you know, is pronounced to be very, very deep. But I guess my question to you is, you're so much larger than Russia economically. They may have a lot more nuclear weapons, but are there behaviors of Russia in this relationship with no bounds that give you concern?
Well, I think China is doing the right thing, urging Russia and Ukraine to stop the war from day one and keeps talking to them in that tone and urging all the other countries not to really pour more fuel onto the fire. Bring the war to an end as quickly as possible before it's too late.
You know, if you look at the Middle East, and again, here at the Doha Forum, a lot of conversations about a potentially completely reshaped Middle East in which a domino effect of October 7th and the Hamas attack against Israel and the response against Gaza, which had led to expansion into conflicts with Hezbollah in Lebanon, you know, with Iran. Now we see in Syria, and Russia, of course, is involved in Syria deeply, or Iran. Where is China in this map? What are your points of concern? Where are the tensions in relationships as you see it? Or are you just sitting on the sidelines?
From day one, again, China called on Israel and the Palestinians to cease fire because China fully respects the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. China has been promoting this two-state solution for decades.
Do you think there's any chance of a real two-state solution?
No, I think we have to achieve that because that's the only way to rid the Middle East of this menace of perpetual fighting and perpetual war between the Israelis and the Arabs, for example.
So you and President Joe Biden are on the same page. Why do you think President Biden has failed so dramatically in achieving a two-state solution?
I think President Biden and his administration is not serious about really promoting the two-state solution because they are very much swayed into providing unlimited financial support and military support to Israel. Now, without the U.S. unconditional support, Israel cannot sustain its long-lasting war against the Palestinians. By now, more than 40,000 innocent Palestinian civilians have been killed. 75% of them are women and children, including many pregnant women. And this has been generally being labeled as atrocities, as a genocide, etc. And Israel is forfeiting all the goodwill it has accumulated ever since its independence. And I think Prime Minister Netanyahu is really turning himself into a person of great liability because he's not helping Israel in any constructive way. He's bringing Israel more and more into a corner. And also, the spreading of war in the Middle East may eventually be very damaging to the fundamental interest, legitimate interests of the Israeli people anyway. So I think the United States should do the right thing. I'm always confused when the American government said we want to give unconditional support to Israel. I think they need to revise that. They need to say, if Israel is doing the right thing, we want to give them unconditional support. If Israel is doing the wrong thing, if Israel is committing atrocities or genocide, for example, why should the United States, the biggest and the most important, most consequential country in the world, give unconditional support to Israel? Further, Prime Minister Netanyahu is being opposed by up to more than 75% of the people in Israel. They want to boost him away from the office. They want to send him to prison, for example. So I think we are really talking about the situation where probably Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to further escalate to avoid being caught up in that legal quagmire that he personally is faced with.
Are you surprised, Victor? This may be too strong a term, but are you surprised from your perspective of also being a major stakeholder? You're now involved in this region more, China's more involved in this region, of the impotence of Arab states with regards to Palestinian situation. I've been surprised that there hasn't been stronger actions, activities across the board. No Arab state has ripped up its peace deal that had a peace deal with Israel. And there's still belief that perhaps down the road, there could even be a Saudi-Israeli normalization, despite what we've heard from Saudi leadership recently, that might ignore the Palestinian state issue and proceed in some normalization. I'm just interested in whether people think that Palestine and a just situation for Palestinians can be ignored to get to a different place there. And are you worried about that?
I'm not worried about that. If you listen very carefully to what the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has to say, they put it very clearly on the table. They would be happy to normalize relations with Israel on one condition. That is, before they do that, the two-state solution should be realized. I think that's the very good position for Saudi Arabia. After all, it is a spiritual leader in this part of the world, and it has a lot of responsibilities on its shoulder to recognize Israel before Israel agrees to a two-state solution. May be considered as a betrayal of the Palestinian people to start with, and also letting down many Muslims, many Arabs, for their real pursuit of the legitimate interest of the Palestinian people. Because fundamentally, Israelis and the Palestinians should be viewed equal with each other. If anyone says Israelis are more superior than the Palestinians and the Palestinians are inferior to the Israelis, and therefore they should not be given equal protection, that itself is an insult to Islam, is an insult to the Muslims. And I don't think the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in its proud self would ever tolerate a prospect like that.
Another area of major Chinese diplomatic investment and economic investment is this organization called the BRICS. BRICS was actually a kind of accidental collection, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Now it's expanded to include other nations, including the UAE and some others. But I'm interested in whether you think the BRICS is serious, like if it's a serious challenge to the US-dominated economic order, the dollar, the SWIFT system, whether that's China's intention to undermine the reserve currency status of the dollar.
Well, first of all, BRICS is serious, and now they already have 10 member states, and the fact that a country like Turkey applied to join BRICS, and Turkey is a member of NATO, is really becoming a turning
Turkey
point.
loves to hedge its bets.
Yeah. It will be a turning point if Turkey officially joins BRICS as a full member.
Or
now,
Saudi Arabia, perhaps.
Saudi Arabia is already a member.
1 foot in and
yes.
Don't go to the meetings.
Yes, but I don't think BRICS is anti-America or is disruptive. I personally am not a big fan of de-dollarization, but I really firmly oppose weaponizing the dollar or weaponizing the SWIFT system. Because if you want to weaponize the dollar or seize other countries' assets at will, for example, and exclude other banks from the SWIFT system, fundamentally or philosophically, you create such a level of despair or apprehension that you want to do something as an alternative. Therefore, when I listen to Mr. Donald Trump talking about slapping 100% tariff against any country which wants to come up with an alternative currency, for example, he was talking about BRICS members, I think President Trump, soon to be, will need to declare that no one should weaponize the dollar and no one should weaponize the SWIFT system. That will reduce the pressure on many countries which want to really have an alternative to the dollar because they worry about the weaponization of the dollar. They worry about the weaponization of the SWIFT system. So we need to really call a spade a spade. And if no one is going to weaponize the dollar, why should any other country really spend a lot of time to come up with an alternative to the dollar?
There is a standoff where many politicians want to preserve and protect Taiwan's autonomy and democracy. And that's a real point of tension for some people. And there's been a worry about what's unfolded in Hong Kong and the trying and sentencing of democracy protesters in Hong Kong. And then, of course, there are people who point to domestic issues inside China, the status of the Uyghurs. I'm sure you've discussed this many times. But that arena, that package is something that is generating more and more political interest and support in U.S. politics, and that affects national security. It's a very big issue with Marco Rubio, who's the likely next Secretary of State, very much for the next national security advisor. So I don't mean to go on it, but I'm just sort of interested in whether there is an understanding about the sensitivity of those issues at the highest levels of the Chinese government.
Well, first of all, I want to tell your global audience that I firmly believe, and many people in China in high positions also believe, like I do, that without democracy, you cannot have modernization. However, democracy does not have one single form which suits all the countries. Every country needs to come up with its own adaptation to democracy and democracy to its own national circumstances. Now, the second thing is autonomy of Taiwan, in my best judgment, need to be preserved for the benefits of the people in Taiwan as well as for China as a whole. Now, eventually, peaceful reunification, which will be much better than any other form, and one country, two system, or even one country, three system, for example, can be figured out. And the Americans worry about the supply chain of the semiconductors. I think China can be flexible enough to declare the whole island of Taiwan as the biggest free trade zone in China, and there will be guaranteed in and out for the semiconductor chips of all kinds. So I think we need to focus on really what's the most important matter, that is the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of China, and the fact that there is only one China and Taiwan being part of China. On that basis, a lot of flexibilities and adaptations can be worked out to satisfy the legitimate interests of many countries, especially the United States, because the United States care about free flow of chips in and out of Taiwan, right, which, in my view, may be a very legitimate consideration.
If President Trump, who likes to be a president who engaged in a lot of firsts, goes to Taiwan, will China be able to live with that?
No, I think if that happens, the diplomatic relations between China and the United States will be broken first, because China will never allow any country in the world, including the United States of America, to have relations with both China on the one hand and Taiwan on the other hand. If you want to bet on Taiwan, and the United States has bet on Taiwan or the nationalist government several times in history, then you need to walk away from China. That's the quid pro quo situation. I don't think any real leader of the United States wants to forfeit U.S. relations with China, which has a population of more than 1.4 billion people, for the sake of encouraging separatism of Taiwan. It's not worth it, and it's not going to work.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Victor Gao, Vice President of the Center on China and Globalization, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
So what's the bottom line? China believes that America is encircling it strategically, trying to curtail China's military and economic growth. It sees an America that's desperately trying to hold on to its crumbling global status while China's global footprint grows. But there are no guarantees about the future. For China, with its growing power, it could easily overstep and suffer, especially if the world's smaller countries see it more as a predator than a friend. And theoretically, at least, America could improve its global standing by decreasing its hypocrisy and working with some of these nations that are in real need. But for now, both sides are watching each other with a lot of distrust. It's a potentially toxic brew that will impact the world over the coming years. And that's the bottom line.